Good evening, everybody. The delay was because we're live, so we're now being recorded, and anything you say will be there for posterity. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Garreth Bloor. I saw him a few months ago, and I said to him, Gareth, you've really got to come up and talk to us. So I'm the guilty party for having brought him up here. I first met Gareth, I think it was quite a few years ago, and we had a breakfast in Cape Town together. And I just remember how amazed I was that I think he was like just out of school in those days. And he'd done all these sort of things. I mean, he's an academic, he's a journalist, he's a politician, and he also enjoys the outdoors. So let me give you briefly his CV, because it's a long one. Any one of these careers would have been a significant one. As an academic, as I said, as an entrepreneur, as a journalist. But most important, from our point of view, is his views on the market and how important economic freedom is. Gareth is currently founder and MD of Glenheim Pty Limited, which is a venture capital fund. That's one of your sidelines, is it? Perhaps the most important part of his CV is this one over here, which is why he's here tonight. For 4 years, until September last year, he was the mayoral executive on the City of Cape Town. He headed departments of economic development, spatial planning, environmental and tourism, and received a nomination to a safe seat in the National Party. He declined to remain in the city. He was elected to public office at the age of 23 in 2011. Towards the end of his stay at Cape Town, they did a assessment of how good or how poor the various officials and local authority councillors were. And the bad news is that Gareth scored extremely badly on it. In fact, it's almost a case of me introducing a failure tonight. What happened was that part of the ways of assessing a person is how many pieces of legislation you've passed or been involved in over the period you've been there. And Gareth's score was a negative 221. So from that point of view, you can see what a disaster he is, which is why he's here. He's going to tell us how to get rid of our pieces of legislation. He was a journalist for 4 years, including British Sky Broadcasting, Cape Media, Chamber of Commerce Publications. He's been on a global, not a national, a global speaking circuit. And I'm just telling you a few of the things: the World Economic Forum. Stop for a moment so you realize what I've just said. Harvard University, again, stop. UCT Graduate School of Business, distinguished speaker. And his next CV will include the Free Market Foundation. He's had over 500 articles published, and he received the Cape Town Press Club Award. He has a number of fellowships, academia, and memberships, including an Association of Private Enterprise Education Scholar in the USA, and the Journal of Entrepreneurship and Public Policy in the US. And at the outset, when he was at the university, he was on the board of the University of Cape Town. He was also involved with Cape Town Tourism, Western Cape Trade and Investment Agency, which is better known as Westgrow. And as a PS, he's also keen on hiking and running and things like that. Gavin, it really does give me great pleasure, and I hope we're going to learn a lot from your experience on how we're going to get rid of some of the bylaws and legislation in the county councils. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. And just a slight correction, if I may. It was the National Parliament where I received an offer. Fortunately, not the National Party. But thank you very much for a very kind overview. And good evening to each one of you, and a special mention to two members of Parliament involved in legislation. I see MP Toby Chance joining us today, as well as his colleague serving as Deputy Chair of the Portfolio Committee, Henry Kruger, focused in particular, I understand, still on small business affairs across South Africa. Well, what I wanted to do this evening is, before I get into the legislation and the tearing up of redundant pre-1994 laws, so many of which have remained on our statutes for a very long time, unquestioned and just assumed to be part of the order of spatial planning in particular, I do want to go into a little bit of a location, a context of where I see the city at the moment, because I think what we're undergoing currently, and this is what the experience of many city governments is is a trend towards taking up increased functions, which cities often do, even if they haven't necessarily got the powers that match it. And I'll go into some detail there and look at a few trends before we get to Cape Town as a case study. The two particular areas in terms of the rise of cities and their importance is the aspect of decentralization and the spirit of federalism. The increasing focus on cities offers a very good opportunity, and we're seeing within academic circles and even philanthropy, and Michael Bloomberg's foundation as an example, a very keen interest in how cities actually drive major changes. But the other aspect is human rights development, civil society, and oftentimes the debate leaves it there. But I would like to argue that that is an important but insufficient basis for real reform, and that is getting into the very nature of local government legislation. I do recall an academic at a meeting in the United States once reflecting on the evils of the Soviet Union, saying that, bear in mind, while Soviet and national governments of its ilk can kill you, local government rules can make you want to kill yourself. And that does go into reflecting, I think, something of the frustration that I encounter, particularly with entrepreneurs, because every business and every new organization occurs at a local level, regardless of whether that's a city, which I'll be focusing on tonight, or whether that's in the case of a smaller town. Cities, in terms of their functions and roles, are entering what I would argue is a phase of competition, and competition informed by a strong sense of pragmatism. When I returned from Beijing 2 years ago, and I know Martin Davies from Deloitte was here focusing on China just a few weeks ago, what was clear is that they had taken hundreds of functions from the national level that sat in Beijing, and then passed that down to local authorities. And a number of local authorities I see are competing with each other to ensure that the way those functions are implemented ensure maximum ease of doing business and efficiency. And that competition is healthy. In the United States, the competition between mayors is certainly very fierce, and mayors aren't afraid to say that. I've heard from mayors of Miami and New York City and other areas. And I think that's a healthy competition, which is very important within the nation state. And that competition, I'd like to say from my observations and that of people like Benjamin Barber, who wrote the book When Mayors Rule the World, is really pragmatic, because very often debates and discussions at a municipal level end up looking at very fundamental bread and butter issues. That offers both an opportunity, but if there isn't a coherent framework about what the role of government is and the nature of legislation, that pragmatism can very easily justify all sorts of things. The circumventions of problems associated with the nation-state level, I think, have taken shape in a couple of forms. New indices like the World Bank's Index of Doing Business, or Ease of Doing Business, focuses now on particular regions and even cities. Their interest is looking at things like building plans and any other functions that cities take on to measure not the way countries simply perform, but how cities perform with each other. If you look at issues that are currently dominating various agendas, including concern over the environment, when the Durban COP meeting took place, parallel to the main negotiations of national governments was a meeting of an organization called ICLEI. And there around 70% of the cities present agreed voluntarily to take various steps without the various measures or requirements set at a national level. And interestingly enough, one of those measures Cape Town took was in the area of energy reform. Given the Eskom monopoly that I know we all sit with, there was a loophole found whereby you can allow individuals to get solar water heaters and as residents opt out of reliance on Eskom-generated electricity. But more than that, the banks came to the party, and through the market, individuals were able to get loans and pay off these solar water heaters over a period of 2 to 3 years. And their monthly payment was less than the energy they were purchasing through the city from the state monopoly Eskom. And a byproduct of that in Cape Town was when the World Wildlife Fund looked at cities that had made the most progress in the area of the environment, based simply on the reductions, or based largely on the reductions on emissions, regardless of one's view on, on the complexities around that issue. But Cape Town scored first place, and Cape Town was named the Earth Hour City. Thank you to our entrepreneurs and our business. I'll never forget the great skepticism when the mayor drove this. And one official, very senior, very nice, well-meaning individual said, "I don't think this is going to work. We only see 2 energy companies in the area of solar water heaters that meet the requirements that the banks demand and that we suspect are demanded." Well, what happened is things forged ahead. And of course, before you knew it, for the first intake, there were over 20 companies that had emerged and that were ready to provide the service, allowing individuals to choose their source of electricity, and of course generating various other recognitions and accolades. Benjamin Barber's case studies, if you're interested in more, and New York City is one he focused on extensively, I think provides a lot of very interesting information. So basically on the notion of federalism, some common shared assumptions largely is that there's an information problem. The bit closer you get to the source, the better. Civil society at a local level very often gets engagement, and the empirical evidence bears this out with local officials. And the accountability of local politicians tends to be greater. In fact, trust levels between individuals and their local politicians versus national politicians tend to be in the region of about 20% higher based on some of the work and studies done. But of course, here's the main contention, something I'm going to focus on tonight in the Cape Town case study. It's impossible for planners, as Hayek pointed out, to gather and interpret all the information and operate things like land use planning, a dominant function of municipalities in South Africa, to operate those in a way that has all the answers. And this is something that where I'd like to juxtaposition now and go into the very issue of the nature of reform and the nature of regulatory repeal. Interestingly enough, the following two professors at the University of Southern California made an interesting observation. Peter Gordon and Harry Richardson noted what they called the outstanding paradox of the simultaneous dismantling of the command and control regimes of Eastern Europe and the introduction of command and control approaches to policy at the local level in the United States. And that has not only happened in the United States, it's happened in various other areas as well. Planning in the 21st century has got to incorporate the evolutionary and the dynamic aspects of today's economy. One of the interesting things I found when it came to 2011, sitting and saying, what is the 30-year plan for Atlantis, is there was no one who could have predicted at that time that 3 or 4 years later, the markets would have changed such that the supply chain to the rest of Africa meant all of a sudden Atlantis became a manufacturing hub. The discussion was, how can we just push tourists here and create a nature park? And so you've got to respond to markets and ensure that the plans put down at the local level do not lock in resources and funding beyond infrastructure commitments over the long term, thereby distorting markets and having an inefficient allocation of funding. And urban planning and land use regulations do need to adopt a market-oriented approach that respect flexibility and changing conditions. And again, we'll go into some of the details there. So answering effectively the question, if we accept the premise of decentralization as part of a commitment to federalism, then when we legislate at that decentralized local level, what is the nature of the legislation? What are the fundamental first principles and the parameters within which a policy is just or not? Because there's a great spatial planning debate happening now between, I believe, those who hold the firm and often very sincere view that cities can be very well meticulously planned out with areas to live, play, work, shop, and others who say there are serious questions around that level of prescriptiveness, and the fallacies there are as notable as there are if you're dealing with the national government situation of planning. So the key is to rethink master planning, which has been the traditional school of thought in South Africa. And of course, the worst expression of this notion of planning would be a system such as apartheid, where not only where you live, work, shop, play, but down to designations around race and the like, of which people have no control. So not all master planners are insidious, evil people, but there certainly is a strong view that rests on the ability of government to do things that I'd be highly skeptical government can do alone. So what are those first principles that I'd like to outline that informed what I experienced as the deregulation process and the reform of legislation in the city of Cape Town? The first is local limitation, and I've covered that. That even if you've decentralized power, there's certain things local government should not be able to do. And removal of discretion is a massive one, where very often various committees still retain enormous decision-making power when it comes to making calls on things like development applications. The right to enterprise. The single zoning scheme, which I'm going to get into in a moment or two, essentially was the key piece of legislation introduced at the city of Cape Town, which on its inception repealed over 221 pieces of redundant legislation. And what that single zoning scheme premised is that the right to enterprise exists much like your right to free speech, not to be curtailed or for you to apply for the right to exercise your free speech or your enterprise, but that if you meet certain conditions prescribed in the single zoning scheme, you have the right to enterprise and to conduct some sort of business operation. And of course, where there are issues where those conditions are not met, what is required in order to meet those conditions is very clearly laid out. And that's important in communities where a history of property rights is non-existent based on injustice, and particularly important on the issue of informal trading. Informal traders continue to suffer enormous challenges, even though in Cape Town, the informal economy has pulled 1 out of 9 people out of poverty, just through simple measures to ensure that the right to, for example, have a permit is respected the way a lease agreement held by a large supermarket is respected, and police can't take that away. The other big one, which is very difficult for many people to gather, is uncertainty of outcomes. It goes against the notion of a 20-year or 30-year plan of what a city will definitely look like. And many people struggle with how to act in the absence of an end goal that is prescribed. Now, the open data policy is one example of this. When the city of Cape Town decided that we're going to take the data we have and put it in the public domain for entrepreneurs, business people, NGOs, civil society to use, whether it's for accountability or for apps, one of the central objections was, well, how do we have any control over the outcomes? And that's exactly the point. We don't have a need to have control over the outcomes. And what we saw as a result of that open data policy was incredible work happening with bus apps, various transportation apps, and all sorts of other things that you see in the city of Cape Town. Just today in the city of Tshwane, I encountered an individual who's created the most incredible app, which allows you to simply take a photograph of a particular challenge, and it feeds through the geo information and sends it straight to the municipality. It's that simple photograph, plus a tag of what the issue is, be it a pothole, a traffic light, is fed straight through. And he said he has this at no cost to government. All he needs is further data. He'll generate his revenue based on other services and sales that will be available on that app. Now, I'm aware of a municipality in that province that has spent 60 million rand attempting to do just that. And the market, specifically entrepreneurs, are able to deliver these things if we just accept a principle of uncertainty of outcomes. The validity of profit. By way of example, again, I came across an individual called Sizwe Nzima, and he doesn't mind me mentioning his name. He looked at long lines and healthcare issues in Khayelitsha, and he said, there's no way that this opportunity cost is tolerable, where people get out of work, where people have to leave home and walk great distances. I'm going to pick up this medication for them and deliver it to the end mile. And of course, initially, he was making a profit, and he still makes a profit. And in fact, he's built a great business with investment from large investment funds, which is absolutely not problematic, but there was a moratorium of sort placed. And his customers stood up and said, hold on a second, we choose this product. We choose to have a private option in the healthcare market for something as simple as this. And in that case, the provincial authorities stepped back, and he's operating that business to great success, to great expansion, and he's on the Forbes top 30 list of emerging entrepreneurs on this continent. So these are incredibly humbling experiences when you're sitting in government believing you have, or sort of trying to solve all of the problems. I think governments should release themselves from some of that burden and realize that creating the enabling environment is absolutely necessary. And of course, property titling, which I touched on. Khayelitsha does a fantastic job of this, but equally for leases that informal traders hold, that's really important so that they don't exist day to day at the whims of law enforcement. There is massive room for pragmatism and consensus at a local government level. One simple point in this regard is that every single bylaw piece of legislation repealed was supported by all parties in the city of Cape Town, from the portfolio committee level right through to the passage through the main council. So for those who say ideological differences are impossible to overcome, very often that is not borne out by reality, and certainly not in my experience. Of course, another key point is process versus personalities. I think, Leon, it goes to a rule of law principle, but tracking applications with individuals opens us up to many problems: lost files, inefficiencies, potential for corruption. So everything needs to be stated up front, and going online with tracking numbers, I think, is one of the best ways to do this. Fairly simple, but so important to take away discretionary powers. And so here we get into the core of the passing, the removal of legislation in the city of Cape Town based on these fundamental principles. And Business Day was the first to cover it with this fantastic headline. People did not believe, some people did not believe, in fact, we were all surprised in the city council level, how many policies, statutes, little bylaws, little structure plans, little zoning schemes, all exist based on pre-1994 assumptions in a very insidious form of master planning. And they are in abundance. Some of them are quite funny. There was one that prescribed how you tie your horse to City Hall in 1881. But others were far more damaging in that they presumed that vast areas of our city did not have the same rights to develop and the same ability as traditionally strengthened areas like CBDs and more affluent neighborhoods. So Africa Check got onto this very quickly, as is the job of civil society, to see if indeed it is true that the city of Cape Town could repeal over 300 apartheid-era policies, structure plans, bylaws, and other procedures. And the verdict was correct. And in fact, this went into the manifesto of the now ruling party in this city and in the city to the north of us to look at other ways to repeal such policies. And that, I think, was very, very exciting. You can see this in Cape Town. Here are the policies that were repealed. The endless laws and rules, and this is not even the full list, that are built up, in the case of Cape Town, over hundreds of years, and which at any time can arise in a development application or a plan as a blockage and as something that needs to require a deviation, an extra process, an additional committee. And a single zoning scheme replaced each and every one of these. Oh, it's more, sorry. And fantastically, this became the basis for Workers' Day, where given the creation of jobs and the performance in the Western Cape, speaking about creating new jobs was the theme and the focus. There you see the end result, the final resting place. And there you see the outcomes, which I'm most excited about. I think this headline was one of the best ones for everyone involved in this process. This was a year after the repeal, 48%, close to 48% year-on-year rise in the value of building plans completed between July and September. That's a vision of the Voortrekker Road corridor on the assumption of new developments coming to fruition. And there's similar structures like this. And in the case of Voortrekker Road corridor, the key repeal was instead of requiring you to have 2 parking bays per flat, you can have 1, and you're welcome to take the bus. And that was the single biggest driver in the feedback received from developers who had put in applications in this respect. Of course, other challenges at that time, like the uncertainty around Eskom and power generation, did have some negative effects, but nonetheless, most of the building plans submitted do go to the next step towards finalization and the beginning of construction. This was critically important for competitive private spaces. In Khayelitsha, previously, commercial office space, commercial retail space, was more expensive than Tiger Valley Shopping Mall, found in a very affluent neighborhood. Why? Simply because the rights and the ability to get commercial zoning and to have that in effect was not present. And so the new zoning scheme gives the same system of rights to properties across the city and divides the city into 8 administrative areas so that people have got easy access to officials and to offices where they can handle particular issues around zoning. And simply the message as a result of this is every municipality in South Africa should make sure that pre-1994 zoning regulations, statutes, spatial plans, and even policies with assumptions that go back to old national laws need to be repealed and need to be revisited. Title deeds, there's no need to go into this here with an audience like this, but it's vitally important for creating those commercially economic nodes. And for informal traders, the ability to set up shop, to plan in order to continue lifting themselves and their families out of poverty. Again, that 1 in 9 statistic is vitally important. And that doesn't mean giving the actual trading plot with a title deed, simply saying you have the right to apply for a lease with the city, and that lease is less than 50 Rand at a charge, and there's the right to trade for that entire year. Using markets and enforcing rules. Pre-approvals and environmental impact assessments can be done by the municipality. There's no need to wait for the private sector to come and identify an opportunity. You can do these bulk applications, and the city can prepare that in compliance with national law. Transport nodes offer huge opportunities, great increases in rental space, and particularly informal trading opportunities, and then area-specific measures. One other point about decentralization is that when you get decentralization to the point of the city, you can further decentralize in the city. So Cape Town has 24 sub-councils, where if something doesn't need to go to the main council because it pertains to that regional community, it can be dealt with and passed then and there. In the Atlantis sub-council, they passed measures to keep a guaranteed turnaround time for building plans within 5 days, to release large amounts of land within the Atlantis area for private development, and to guarantee bulk electricity supply. And the city said they would not increase the electricity price going into the next year. It would always stay at the pre-financial year. So you had it, instead of increasing every 12 months, instead of paying the 2015 rate, you'd be paying 2014. Slight incentives there, the rush for land is such that the last time I checked, almost all of that land was taken. Atlantis has seen headlines in various publications like Boomtown, where at a time when we entered council in 2011, the situation was very dire. And people said, how do you ever revive a far-flung community 40 kilometers north of the core economic activity of Cape Town? But it certainly happened, and there's a lot that's happening in that community overall. Leveraging municipal property, there's not enough land due to government. The government owns much of the land. If you don't necessarily want to sell that land, at least generate income off it. And so we've got examples where the Bandwidth Barn in Khayelitsha is a property made available for entrepreneurs. Very exciting companies coming out of that. There's some of the students with some visitors. People come from all over. It's not just Khayelitsha residents. Same thing in Woodstock. Several massive companies have emerged. Some of them you may have even read about in the media. Provide the space, a lower rental, and allow businesses to have a good start. It's much better than trying all these active programs and training and all sorts of things often run by people who haven't themselves had a business. Just allow individuals to get in, get a site, and to do their thing. Youth entrepreneurship is growing in Cape Town. Various studies suggest it's the biggest startup hub, though I see Johannesburg also boasts an incredibly vibrant commercial sector and startup focus. Many Cape Townians have made the Forbes list, many of them coming through these programs. 2 of the entrepreneurs on this list actually came through the 2 programs I just alluded to earlier, where you're making it easier to do business by simply providing a R1 a year lease and allowing the private sector to come on and run programs. The Raymond Ackerman Academy, for example, comes and runs one such program. And in fact, Sizwe Nzima, who was in Khayelitsha, came through that program. So fantastic cooperation and incredible goodwill from the private sector. Just make available the space, quite literally, and also in terms of policy. Unexplored options and concepts, incentives for informal trading bays and new developments. That was not, I did not finish my term and successfully get around to this. And to provide a tender, this comes from Mark Pennington in the UK. He's very focused on land issues. To say, instead of having, just like business companies or governments outsource, why don't governments outsource the issue of analyzing development plans as much as they do so many other functions? And then the big debate around the urban edge. Do you constrain development deliberately by creating an urban edge on the argument that you're going to have lower costs, lower infrastructure, lower operational maintenance because you've got fewer roads and it's more dense? Or in fact, are you just driving property prices up within that area, benefiting existing landowners and forgetting people who could get into the market if land was made available outside and there was more competition? That debate's very pronounced in the United States. It was getting very pronounced in the city of Cape Town before I left. I don't actually know if it's been a debate here in Johannesburg. But just to say, I thought I would add that in case there are any discussions or debates in that respect. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to getting into some discussions. Cool.
Going through my mind, but let me ask if there are any questions in the audience here.
Thanks, Terry. Andrew Barker, I'm a town planner and development consultant, so I'm all ears of what you're doing. Joburg is in the process of revising its land use management scheme in terms of the new legislation. How can we bring this thinking into that document now? Because at the moment, we're just rehashing the old stuff. And to come in now with something fresh like this, to me, is an absolute opportune moment to influence that thinking now. If we delay, we're going to end up with a horrible elephant again.
Sure. And in that respect, the one thing we did in Cape Town is yeah, sure.
Just to add to that, it's interesting the debate in Houston, where they've had virtually no controls. They're now saying, given the flooders, that we've gone too much to the other extreme. So I'd just like to put that into a very valid question.
Yeah, great. So with regard to recognizing the issue, we did an audit in Cape Town with the help of various universities to go into the archives and actually see how much legislation had built up over time. And I think when you see the volume of that, it becomes very evident that there's no way a city can function at its peak when there are redundant laws that exist. The other aspect is I have done a workshop with various councillors, just sharing an experience for those who are in Johannesburg, and I found that was very well received. And again, it was all parties who came through. It wasn't just confined to whoever happened to be the leading party within that coalition. I think when it comes to the question of Euston, there have been various debates in play there. The one that so the first thing to say is this. The City of Cape Town's current land use system is not the same as Euston's, so we don't have tradable rights. And what we simply have looked at is ensuring that there's absolute certainty upfront as to what's required in order to comply, and to ensure that you don't need to apply for any sort of permission from us as government if you meet the statutes and the requirements that are preordained and listed and very clear. So nobody can sell their right in Cape Town at the moment to somebody else. I am no expert in Euston's town planning, apart from knowing that their system is not the same one we use in Cape Town. But I have heard many counter-arguments that simply the flooding levels would have been pretty much what they were if development had happened under a different system in Euston. Again, that's all been anecdotally, so I wish I had a bit more information, but I'm only aware of the South African context, yeah. Sorry
Can I
about
just
that.
mention Houston? I mean, I did some reading research many, many years ago. There was a book that came out called Land Use Without Zoning by Bernard Segan, who was an advocate and got very involved in the whole rezoning and the town planning thing. I haven't followed it for the last 20 years, and I think there may have been some changes, but as of 30 years ago, the title of the book said Land Use Without Zoning. There was no zoning whatsoever in Houston. So a property developer A buys up a piece of property, and he can do anything on that piece of property. There's always the edge constraints, so everybody's going to know that I don't want to be next to sewage works, and because that's probably the first question you're going to ask, make no mistake about it, the developer's going to get there first. Once he decided this was going to be residential, they had what we would call title deeds a covenant, and you could stipulate in the covenant what percentage of people had to agree before that land use could be changed. It's almost like I suppose like a complex of a residential area. If you want to change something there and get a new broom, everybody's got to agree. That's a bit parochial, but in Houston, it was a case of your rights were virtually impregnable, total rights. So in other words, there was no local authority that would come along and take your rights for any reason. The other very interesting about Houston, is that in the CBD, all property is owned up to the center of a road. So in the CBD, the council has a right-of-way servitude, I don't know, 3 or 4 meters below the road level and 3 or 4 meters above the road level for the roadway and for services. What that means is that two properties on either side of the road can get together above that 4 meters or below that 3 meters without having to get to the local authority for permission. And if you look at a map of Houston, I made the statement many years ago, I don't know if it's still true, I believe that there are more pedestrian bridges over and below the road than anywhere else in the world. You can just, because it's so easy to do it. So by and large, it was the last major city in the whole of America that didn't have any zoning. But more important here, I think that we've got to find a way of getting you back here to do workshops and so on. I mean, that's the critical thing. And Andrew, I don't know whether we've got enough time now. I mean, but we can talk about that.
It's out for comment now. Until 13th of October.
Okay, well.
So if we're going to do it, we've got to do it now. And it's going to have to be a radical and very influential input to actually say, whoa, pull back and relook and rethink. This management scheme has been under process for I don't know how many years now.
I think if you could give us some indication of Cape Town didn't just happen.
Sure.
Somebody, you touched on your chat, there was a champion. A champion who understands the concept and then had the ability with people like yourself to translate from an academic concept into the practical situation.
Well, certainly I remember Helen Ziller being the first to identify the problem, and before moving over to Premier, it was highlighted and a process to audit and find all these existing laws was initiated. And when Patricia de Lille came in, she came in 2011. If I'm not mistaken, by 2012, the repeal already started with the first 200 or so old pieces of legislation. So it does sometimes take a little while, but in the instance where you are creating a new scheme, if that scheme is able, on its passage, to have an annexure that says this scheme will supersede and then list the current outdated, redundant pieces of law, then there's no need to actually slow this process down. This process can go to council by its allotted date if you can have a whole lot of academics, researchers, auditors get together and start to actually do a check of what exists at the moment in the city of Johannesburg. So it's not necessarily a process that has to drag on for a long time. If we repealed every single law individually, then I wouldn't be the worst performing councillor. I'd be pretty bad.
That's better.
You were talking about Cape Town has sub-councils. I think you said 24 sub-councils. I'm trying to think of how many wards we have within Johannesburg. It's well over 100 anyway. Yeah. Would that go down to a ward basis so the wards themselves can actually make the decision? And also, within Cape Town, each ward is allocated a certain amount of money to be used at their discretion, so that the communities themselves can say, well, we've got this money, let's spend it on this because it's really important to us. I'd just like to get your comments on how far down you can actually take this sub-council. Can you take it down to a ward level? The ward council system isn't working properly, so it needs to be overhauled.
Sure. So the average number of wards that make up a sub-council is around about 6 in Cape Town. And the individual ward committees make recommendations to that sub-council, but they themselves do not make decisions on their own. So each ward committee, usually 6, sometimes 7, 8, get together and then they meet within the sub-council. And one of the reasons for that is just resources. When you formally pass legislation and you give, essentially, you move from one council to 24 sub-councils, there are quite a lot of overheads. And I think we would run into administrative inefficiencies if we went any further down. Right now, each sub-council is ideally located within walking distance or within a transport route of each community that they serve. So the ability, usually you'll find when the budget is considered within the sub-council, you've got representatives from each of the ward committees there to make sure that their inputs are being reflected by their local councillor.
Question, these meetings and the representatives from the ward council, are they actually public meetings? Because I'll just give you, for instance, within our ward we have a ward council, and every single one of them is from a very small area in the northeast, has no similarities to the rest of the ward.
So just to get your specific question, how?
Problem that we've got specifically,
right.
And maybe it's within other areas, that the ward council and the members are in a tiny geographical area within the ward and have no understanding of what's happening within the rest of the area.
Right. I mean, that would be a challenge in somewhere like Atlantis, which is incredibly far removed from the main sub-council. That's one of the exceptions. Now it's on the My City route, so public transport ensures people have that access. But usually when the consultative meetings are taking place, they shift around so that each community does get a chance to meet people from other areas. So that's done quite deliberately so that you do touch each geographic area. So that's just one of the practical measures that are undertaken in that respect. Thank you.
So you just heard 1, 2, 3. Anybody else have that? 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I heard you mention more of the property rights, but I just want to understand what is your intake on the intellectual property rights, especially in South Africa, because with the technology that is coming in and we're playing in the ICT space, you find that it is very difficult to actually advance this technology because of we mostly judge on the international intellectual property laws. So you don't have the community property management. So it becomes difficult, especially for the rural areas, to develop or find a solution for their communities and actually get to advance them, because now they need to be institutionalized. So where you get to the university, they look at the feasibility study of all those things, and now these guys, they form on doing the project that solve their problems, but their problems, their solutions just disappear. So I actually even want to understand how even on Cape Town is that happening, because here in Gauteng, it's actually a problem.
Sure. Yeah, so certainly I think that's a problem around the country. At the Bandwidth Barn in Khayelitsha, for example, and other venues, they do have IP workshop, and usually they're brought in by a very serious company that is part of their CSI, like some are sponsoring title deed projects or want to, they would sponsor workshops like these. My experience is that still when these businesses get to the point where they're getting external investment, they're now moving over to new markets, they are placing their IP in other jurisdictions because they're not confident that the IP regime in South Africa works. So it seems, so there's some efforts to provide understanding and education, but when people have the opportunity, certainly anecdotally, what I've observed is they then move their IP abroad, invariably to Mauritius or other jurisdictions.
Thank you. I just want to engage you based on the slide that you have shown there about the limit of authority within the council or the municipality. So personally, I am in the business of used oil collection. So amongst the requirements that one has to be officialized, I mean to be operating within that particular industry, one has to register with the provincial department, which is Gauteng in my case. But other than that, you've got to register with each municipality that you will be operating on as a waste transporter. So from now on, so it took me like 2 days to register with the Gauteng government as a waste transporter. But operating in the city of Joburg, you will still be approached by the police officer to say, no, you cannot operate in this area. You need to register with the city of Joburg as a waste transporter. Despite my affiliation with the provincial government. You go to the city of Ekurhuleni, you're still approached by the police officers, no, you cannot operate there. You go to the city of Tshwane, you've got to register with the municipality. And now all these municipalities that I've mentioned, they're all within the provincial, the Gauteng province. So talking about our constitution, chapter 3 to be specific, which talks about corporate governance and which actually advocates for coordinations of actions between the national government, the province, and the municipality. Do you think that is not in transgression with that kind of clause to say, if I have registered with the city, with the Gauteng province, why would a council or the city of Joburg, describe me to be a lawless sort of, operator because I didn't, register with the city of Joburg or the city of Ekurhuleni? To me, that's very much absurd. And which kind of progress, program should be repealed? Is the province had to say, okay, you know what, we're now leaving it to the municipality? Or has the municipalities to say, you know what, since you've registered with the province, I think you can just operate in here. You don't have to go all these long processes.
Absolutely. Well, in principle, I usually say if it can be handled by the municipality, then let it be. But very often these issues are fought out in the courts. Each sphere of government, and we go to court, or City of Cape Town went to court a lot, and each sphere of government believes that it has the right to legislate on something. And so fortunately we won court cases both against provincial authorities and against national authorities when there were laws that were being made that actually did not fall within that mandate, including sometimes cases against ministers themselves who operate on the belief that they may exist at a level instead of at a sphere of government based on the notion of concurrent powers, where we have different powers but we're equal in our value as each sphere of government. So I would say the best thing would be to maybe see if organizations like FMF can have a look and offer some insight into who actually is the legitimate authority. And then you can simply say, whichever authority is interfering and acting outside its mandate, hold on no more. You can't illegally now just shut me down. What we set up in the city of Cape Town was a line that people could call where they could simply phone with a particular issue that they had. And we would often take it up with the province or the national government if applicable. And the resolution rate, was fairly good, about 96% within 48 hours. Most people got their answer within that period. just by having a group of dedicated people who could go and look into that. So I think that dedicated resource, while unfortunate that you've got to put more into that, it is necessary for the long term, and also just to deal with immediate needs at the moment in a very complex regulatory environment. I mean, I was sharing earlier on that I know people who've sold a portion of their business just to be a subsidiary of another business who happens to have a license which they've had for 20, 30 years. And it really is not the level playing field that we want in this country here.
And just to add more to that, in my case, for example, you find that maybe it was more easier to register with another authority than the other authority. You go to the city of Ekurhuleni, they are demanding 1, 2, 3. You go to the city of Joburg, a very totally different sort of requirements. And I'm like, what informed them to arrive into these all different, decisions?
Sounds like the problem you've got is that you're expanding too quickly into all the different local authorities. I think, did you also want to talk? So, number 4, thanks.
Can I just add just one point, if I may, just to that? Very often people will say different municipalities have different requirements. That's why the national government should standardize everything. I would rather say, yes, have different requirements, but realize that your ability to legislate is curtailed on certain first principles, so that there can be competition between cities, but no municipality can overstep its mark, as opposed to simply a blanket federal prescription across time and space. Thanks.
Thanks. You know, 5.
Yes, I'm in architecture, and obviously I experience a lot of interaction with the council. But my main concern is what we call squatter camps. The people are living in a certain space which they have allocated to themselves. Nobody else got any use for that space. Why can't these areas be surveyed by satellite survey? There's enough technology to do it, and give title deed to that person for that piece of land. Then he's got something to hold on to, he's got something to lose, he's got something to develop, and he's got something to call his own. He's got something to trade. And what would that do to our economy? The problem that I see with councils is that they forgot their role completely. In management, you normally have this tier of management which I just would like to depict like that. My concept of management is it should be like that. It is a support structure, not a governing structure. And before councils get that right, nobody, the ordinary man in the street, the ordinary person, is not going to be supported by a system that is there to actually support it. The system must regulate, yes, and for everybody's safety. There are very good things in government, but the municipality is not the citizens' boss. They've got it wrong. And if I want to submit a plan to council, I have to go submit my plan. I have to leave it at the counter. 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, I may go back and I may receive comment. Then they will give you comment, and you will change the drawings accordingly, and you'll resubmit it. And sometimes that happens 8 to 9 times over. It's wrong.
Absolutely.
At Ekurhuleni, as the gentleman just said, they had a system which was brilliant, that you could go in on a Wednesday morning, stand in a queue, which is fine. All the departments were sitting around the table, and your plan went in on one side, comments, and you correct your comments there as you go through, and you went out with the approved plan on the other side. Now that was a good system. That was supporting development. The system that is used right throughout all the councils, to my experience, is that you submit a plan, and then you're at the mercy of the government to wait until they actually found time between all the computer games they play, etc., to make one comment on your plan. And then once they've made the one comment, it's not a comprehensive comment. You will correct that, you'll go back and they'll make more comments. So there are inherent problems in the system as it exists. And before local authorities and government itself is being told that they are a support system, not a governing system, this will never stop.
And you know, the key thing there is the ability to track your application. And so with these reforms, on the operational side, that's policy. The ability was, it was implemented that you could submit everything online. And if you had a particular concern around the fact that I'm not sure there's some gray areas, you could do a pre-submission, and that would be assessed for you so that you could be instructed before your formal submission where there's a need for more certainty or a few changes, and you could submit then with peace of mind. And the other aspect is that instead of 4 departments or 6 each getting their turn to comment, it's simultaneous. And you can consider it approved if you haven't commented within your time frame as an official, and you are accountable for the fact that something has passed which shouldn't have because you did not meet the statutory time frame. Midvaal municipality, I understand right here in Gauteng, is actually doing that very, very well, based on what I pick up from internal assessments of various municipalities. I think that's certainly a great example. And Atlantis and within that particular sub-council in Cape Town, also those 5-day turnaround times are useful, just practical.
That's why we carry professional indemnity.
Right.
Because if you make a mistake like we all do, at least you're covered if that mistake blows up in your face. And you have to have professional indemnity.
Yeah, you know, sometimes I'm often worried more about what we lose, not through mistakes, but through opportunities, developments, and things that never come to pass simply because of inefficiency and delays and fear, which I think drives a lot of people in government, this concern about making a mistake. It's part of life. And if people admit when the mistake is made, I tend to find that at a community level, most people are pretty forgiving. Just don't steal, just don't rob, just don't deliberately put things in people's way. That's based on my own personal experience, just as a public representative.
Sorry, Kelly, I think I have another question.
Sorry,
I'll come back to you in a moment. Hold on a second. Hold on, you've had a long time. And number 4?
I just want to ask, Cape Town's got quite a traffic problem. Now, I mean, looking at it from an outsider's point of view, you would say that it would be good to upgrade the railway lines. They seem very historic, but they're presumably in the hands of Metro Rail. So what can the council do where you have another entity that doesn't seem to be interested in doing anything what they want? Huh?
Well, the big one is to still engage as proactively as possible with many reasonable people in other spheres of government, in this case national in particular, because there are groupings within the departments and the agencies who do believe that the city needs to take control. Most cities run their own rail service as a matter of best practice, instead of decisions in Tshwane impacting what happens in Cape Town. So the rail is the big ticket item. If that is integrated into Cape Town's public transport system, then that's a huge alleviation of current traffic problems and congestion. In the interim, the My City bus service is the one infrastructure project designed to assist with that. If when you are saying to developers there are fewer parking requirements, it is important to have other options on the table. The taxi service, the private taxi service, minibus taxi service, still does an absolutely fantastic job, and so making sure those sites and demarcations are in place is vitally important. But the key thing is, when there is an infrastructure investment like My City, you've got to make sure that you don't plow into money into things where, if after 5 years there's a change in commuter behavior and patterns, you can't easily pick up that route, knock down a little bus shelter, and put that route back on track. So that flexibility is very important in terms of the capital investment to run public transport systems. But the big ticket item is the rail service, because it is incredibly comprehensive. If you look at the Cape Town rail service, it gets you to the overwhelming majority of spots across the city. And the worst served areas are areas like Constantia and the like, where really those are not the people we're concerned about. They have cars and they're doing fine. So it is a huge problem. It is a huge problem.
Could I just add a little comment on that, just an anecdotal, very short one. My daughter actually was commissioned and wrote a study on behalf of the provincial Minister of Public Infrastructure, Robin Carlyle, who our speaker knows well. And they were looking on whatever way they could work through the legislation, whatever, to try and get some influence over it. And ultimately, the whole thing was blown apart. They could get nowhere because of the internal fight between what we now know was going on in Prasa, Lucky Montana, and the various state capture things. So you had the legal system on the one other, and on the other hand you had this whole state capture nonsense, Lucky Montana and going on. The report's still there, and the basis is there. And Gareth knows her.
And look, if I can just say, I don't know how the private taxi service works here, but in Cape Town, it is so common to see tourists get on minibus taxis, which are often characterized as death traps and lawless and so forth. I mean, the kitted out taxis I've been in for R7 to get from Sea Point into downtown Cape Town, with TVs, good music, friendly people, and certainly the fastest way from A to B, I think shouldn't be ignored. And I think that's something that's often missed quite often, is just how many people are transported without any government intervention or very little every single day. And if we can unlock that sort of innovation in so many South Africans, we could solve so many more problems, transport being one of them. The various apps that are in place now are designed to give traffic alerts, such as the one I mentioned earlier today, that actually with GPS picks up where traffic is blocking up, and in real time tells the user, again at no cost to the government, but tells the resident which areas you can avoid and where you can get the best way in. Something that I believe Google Maps does not do at the moment. So yeah, wait, sorry, okay, so they've got that, yeah. But again, also allows for public service announcements and other things like that too. So look, there are all sorts of things that are already happening now, again, which would not have been predicted maybe 10, 15 years ago. And so I think we need to be open to solutions that we actually are not fully aware of as we speak in what may come in 2022, 2025. So I'd just be very hesitant to go on grand plans again, going back to the earlier point.
I have a question here and then one at the back.
Sure. Thanks, Garrett, for a very nice presentation. Sorry. It seems to me that you feel that Cape Town is sort of doing things the right way, right? Or at least has been doing things over the past few years. Would you add 2 or 3 cities in South Africa that you think have potential or are sort of following that direction? And do you think is that competition there? Do you sense that there's competition between cities in South Africa? Just in your observation.
So the second point, I think there is competition, and I think often it happens with foreign direct investment, where people may go to different sites or different provinces, and so cities in South Africa are often competing with each other in that way, but it's usually for foreign direct investment in most instances I've seen. Other cities that are following the sort of things done in Cape Town, I mean, up here I'm going to be meeting with other municipal councillors starting tomorrow. So I'm just not equipped to answer that question at the moment because my focus has been entirely in Cape Town. But is there an openness to these sorts of ideas based on discussions that I've had with people of all parties? Absolutely. The pragmatism that's there is significant. And look, a lot of councillors that I meet are so overwhelmed with issues, with problems, community concerns, the usual work and operations within their own party, that they're just saying whatever the solution is, bring it to the fore. Let's do it. Let's implement. So I think that the opportunity to coherently put that into the sorts of changes and mindsets that were described earlier is there. That didn't happen in Cape Town in year 1 of a new administration. And so, you know, the thing is not to be, I think, despondent if it appears that some things are slow. It seems to me there have been various priorities put in place in other municipalities in South Africa, usually pertaining to corruption issues. And that was the case in Cape Town. Dealing with corruption was certainly put at front and center at the early stages.
Thanks, Gareth. You'll be number 1 again, 2 and 3 at the back.
I'd just like to get, what was the City of Cape Town's response to the licensing of businesses bill that came out, DTI bill in 2014, I think? And what is the balance that you struck between, you know, providing rights to, for example, informal traders through licensing mechanisms and avoiding over-regulatory burdens? So, you know, I can understand what you're trying to do, but how did you sort of finesse that particular problem?
Well, absolute opposition to the business licensing bill, which proposed licensing a business just for the sake of having another license or requirement. And the problem with that is that the penalties in that bill too were completely up to the discretion of municipal officials who could at any stage seemingly revoke a license. So the first thing was just like the point of we have the right to free speech, inalienable. So we inalienably have the right to enterprise. And licensing, or more broadly, a restriction or a requirement, comes into play when there's an impact on somebody else. And so if somebody's not doing anything legal and is complying with preset rules and regulations, then there should be no need for them to go get extra permission, particularly for a bill like that offered unbelievably wide powers and discretions that are inconsistent with the rule of law. So we have not seen the necessity from a law enforcement perspective for a bill like that that would just add another layer of bureaucracy within the municipality. The way it's dealt with is with the existing, we believe the existing framework is more than sufficient, to put it that way. Does that answer the question?
Licenses, I mean, a license is required to trade.
Absolutely, but that's not a license in the sense that you are given the right to trade for no particular reason. That license is tenure. It's more so a case of saying, here's a contract between the landowner, the municipality, and yourself, which is no different to a contract that a large corporate, like a large supermarket chain, enters into if it happens to be renting government space. It's no more a license than it is in that situation of an established business. It's to ensure property rights and that no law enforcement official can simply come on a whim and say, all of you today, we don't like you, we got complaints, you've all got to go out. That is a protection mechanism. I would say it's more akin to a property right than a license in that respect.
My question is a bit like this gentleman here. In the United States, it seems that if you're a big enterprise and you want to develop your business, put new factories and develop, you just throw out your CV into the marketplace and you say the cities come and compete. Tell us why we should no longer be in Seattle or Silicon Valley, and let's go and move to wherever you want to get to, whatever you can offer us. So cities have become very business oriented. And so it's no longer a case of just reducing bureaucracy and perhaps getting away with legislation. It's a case of actually becoming business-like in yourself. And I think this works not only for FDR, but I think it works in South Africa for a lot of other industries as well. Any comments on that?
Sure. I think the risk in some of that competition is an overstep of what those cities are offering. So when it starts becoming a point of large subsidies, where you can say, well, we've got 400 new jobs, but the cost is millions upon millions to get that business there, that then becomes, I think, quite questionable. So the approach to take is to say, based on your ability to have trust with the local authorities, to easily expand, respond to market conditions, procure supply chain, those become the factors that become important in cities competing and having this. Otherwise, you run into a situation like Atlantis, where the previous National Party massively subsidized that area. It's not a city that comes about naturally and organically. And then what happens when there's a change in politics, and certainly not one as dramatic as the change we had then, it could simply be an administration, then all of a sudden there's a market correction and you actually suffer huge fatalities and you've had an enormous expenditure that you could have used on better things. Sure.
Clever businesses realize
That's not long term.
It's what else can you offer?
Yeah.
You offer us a well-educated labour force, that sort of stuff. What residential areas have you got?
Absolutely.
So I agree with you. I don't think it's no longer subsidy.
Sure.
It should be much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah. So what's being done in the city of Cape Town is there's an office, a director of investment within the mayor's office, and for every amount of investment over a certain type, which then incurs complexity, you have what's in effect a private banker who takes you and walks you through that process. So no circumvention of the law, but simply somebody who says, look, we can sit down and have a meeting and work this out. And of course, that well covers the cost initially because you've got so much in terms of rates and other benefits to the city that come about. So the ability to pick up the phone and call someone, I think, is a major one. And with that comes corruption, a corruption-free environment. And so clean audits done by good auditors are vitally important.
Thanks, Garreth. And I think the repealing of all these bylaws that have become redundant is a good starting place, is a good starting point for a South African envisaged or municipality envisaged by Spluma, let's say. I think the first question would be, has Spluma played a pivotal role in the repealing of all these laws? And the second question would be around I think this is a starting point, but it opens up opportunities for the creation of just cities. Getting all the stakeholders involved, especially if you look at it in light of sector charters that have been drafted and the investment that companies have to throw in enterprise development, in economic development, and in enterprise and supply development. Have you seen the conversation being started amongst the private sector in partnership with municipalities around how do we cater to the different stakeholders, how do we cater to informal, in inverted commas, really informal sector of society, and informal in it being that it's not really rationalized the way the free market has, or the market has otherwise thought of it. So around those partnerships, question 2, and around Spluma, question 1.
Yeah, so I'll start with Spluma. This was a piece of legislation introduced by the national government, which I think very commendable intentions, and it was really designed to get municipalities to start to rethink the way their spatial configuration was. It complemented, I think, more so than triggered what happened in the city of Cape Town, but its timing certainly was very, very useful because it really did question fundamental assumptions about how South African cities are constructed. So Spluma was complementary. Where there were some objections to Spluma was concern that it did afford officials within municipalities too much discretion. However, municipalities are able to legislate against that discretion, can actually say we don't want our officials to exercise so much discretion. So it's a positive. There is a mechanism within municipal law that does allow these sort of private sector partnerships and charters to exist quite efficiently. And that is through a section in the Municipal Finance Act, I believe, which allows you to create essentially a private organization where the government sits on the board and may contribute in kind or in a small donation of some sort, and then that entity reports back to the council monthly or every quarter. But the real impetus and input comes from the private sector. So, if, for example, there's this discovery as there was of massive oil deposits, and Cape Town became, as it was, a great center for oil and gas repair, employing thousands of people on any given day for ships that otherwise had to bypass and go to Singapore or go over to South America. Those businesses wanted skills on the supply side and were more than happy to put money into this particular entity, which ran on the principle of a private company and could easily rechange its strategy, but had a reporting line back to the municipality, which kept government up to speed, but also allowed government to provide impact in the portfolio committee without directing to the board of that organization how they should run things. And they're great because when you no longer need them, you wind them up. So there used to be one for real estate agents. That sector is well taken care of in South Africa, in Cape Town. It doesn't exist anymore. So that is more efficient, I believe, than a public-private partnership in the sense most people know it, because that can take 2-3 years to set up. Whereas you look, I believe it's Section 80, to set up one of these entities is actually relatively straightforward, and it does allow people in a particular corporate sector to put in money, whether through CSI, whether through training for people who are going to work in that industry that they want to focus on.
I've got one more question. Anybody else want to ask the question yet? You was wanted? I will take 1, 2, 3, and then we'll pour into that.
You're talking about having really a fourth level of government in having the sub-councils here, and it takes it closer. So I'm actually in approval of that. But if we take a look, make a comparison, and I don't want you to make a comparison, well, this is Europe and this is Africa. It's a basic structure. If we take a look at Switzerland, they have 7 million people. They have 2,600 communes, which is the equivalent of our local councils. The smallest I've found is 59 people. And the important thing is that it works. We've got 52 million people here, and I think we've got about 126 councils. And the bigger it gets, the further away it gets, and the more complex it gets. And it seems to be wanting to consolidate bigger and bigger entities and getting less and less efficient. What's the problem with having a group of people who are self-sufficient, who meet the criteria of getting all the services in, don't interfere with anybody else, and can finance themselves actually setting up a small council like that?
Well, from a purely voluntary perspective, it's actually perfectly possible, not able to supersede, of course, in South Africa, any existing municipality or municipal structure, but to complement it. So in the turnaround of the Cape Town CBD, a slightly larger example, but in other communities too, the creation of central improvement districts have seen businesses voluntarily pay directly into their community a tax that doesn't go into some central pot somewhere, but goes into that area. And then there's a meeting that gathers together and votes through that same entity I referred to earlier on how best to do this and administer. So there are spaces within South Africa where you can complement. I've seen some unfortunate cases where homeowners associations have wanted to completely break away and create their own endless rules about how you paint your fence, what color your doorknob is, and demanding that the municipality supersede its power to them to impose these preferences of any given ratepayers committee on everybody else. And so obviously that then becomes hugely problematic unless that entire community is private and completely voluntary. So it is possible to complement what we have that is existing.
You're talking about complementing it rather than saying creating a totally independent, separate entity, a third level of government, and making them smaller and smaller rather than bigger and bigger.
I think in that case, so you could decentralize further to smaller units. Okay, yeah. I think that again the inefficiencies may be problematic, but maybe that's based on the current macro structure of South African municipalities, and Switzerland's whole macro structure is completely different from the outset.
I just want to understand what is your, especially the communication between the cities, despite of political indifferences, because if you look at the space where we play, especially in the ICT, you find that there's geolocation collusion, because now you'll find that the big ICT company is probably providing the service and closing the market with the city of Cape Town, and then also the other one that they are more on the same competition level is coming to the city of Joburg. So now the one, if is operating in Joburg, the other one can only operate in the Cape Town. And if you look at that, because they work with the municipality, it's a collusion. But now they make their collusion on their geolocation, because the other one cannot go and operate on the other space, can only operate on there. So what is the communication between the cities in terms of that?
Just a quick point of clarity. So is it required in law that these companies can only operate, if they operate in one municipality, they can't in another, or is it just the convention that developed?
No. It's a collusion, because they sit as a companies to say, if we bid for probably a tender or to run the municipal systems, if I go and take the city of Cape Town, now it's my territory. You cannot take the city of Cape Town. And then the other one will say, okay, if you take the city of Cape Town, then I'll take the city of Joburg. So in that sense, because of their financial capacity, they make it difficult for the smaller guys to come in and operate in such, because they close the market. So what's the communication between the cities to say, in terms of the communication, to understand or unpack that? Because we also made the submission to the Competition Commission to actually for them to look into that, to say these guys are closing the doors, or they are creating barriers into entry for the smaller guys, because they are colluding, especially on the prices, because they control the price, they have a bigger market share, but now we cannot come into saving the cities or the municipalities.
I'm not familiar with any of those cases of collusion, certainly within the city of Cape Town, and obviously not with any other municipality, so I don't know. So maybe just on ICT policy, it might be useful to chat to someone else here who might be more knowledgeable. But I mean, my key argument is that oftentimes the competitive advantage enjoyed by these larger companies is simply by the fact that they have the resources to comply with deeply onerous legislation, and that becomes their competitive advantage. And the key is to say, how do we then remove those barriers so that you have a fair playing field, instead of bringing in the cause of the initial problem, regulators, and say on top of this try now create more regulation, that's going to then benefit smaller players. Because often these smaller players in those circumstances, may become subcontractors or something to that effect. But do they have the main license? Do they have the ability to easily start the business quickly, efficiently, with minimum overheads? That often becomes the key question and the barrier to competitiveness, in my personal experience.
So have a chat with Leon afterwards, because we've been doing quite a lot of work in the ICT field, and we can have it maybe give you some advice there. Okay. Last one.
Thank you. I just want to share with you a practical scenario, and this is about the cost of doing business well in South Africa. So from home, I'm coming from Limpopo, from the rural areas, and what I'm witnessing now, I'm witnessing a trend where you normally see people developing or starting their own businesses instead of maybe starting the business within the nearest towns and everything. That is more like decentralization. And my question here is, obviously, the reason why they are doing that is because it's much more easier, because at home you just go to the induna or the king and say, I'm looking for this kind of land, I want to develop it and build 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to contribute in terms of job creation, and it becomes just easier like that. And right now, you see most of professional people, sometimes when they get out maybe of the corporate space, they will use their pension fund monies and everything to develop the area. Like you see a lot of this shopping center that is being built. I'm talking about deep rural areas now. So the question that I would love to ask you is, are we likely to witness sort of a reverse urbanization in favor of rural development? Because I'm talking about something that I just see. People are much more passionate about going home, starting their own businesses, invest there, other than buying your KFC franchise elsewhere because of this red tape, and string regulation within these big cities. So perhaps in 50 years, 30 years, 40 years, are we likely to see something like that?
It could very well happen. At the moment, the trend is fully towards urbanization, and people who do relocate, again, based on those examples I've seen, may have achieved the level of success and affluence within that urban environment where the economies of scale and the like, and then they've relocated more based on a lifestyle choice than a commercial need to a community where it's more than just a profit that is important. There's some other things too. But I don't think that we will see a trend anytime soon away from urbanism. And for the first time, well, a couple of years ago, a majority of us as South Africans live in cities. And that presents a great opportunity, because if cities get things right, then you can impact an enormous number of people. And the more there is that mobility, the more choice people have as to which city they go to and where they take their skills. Those individuals I refer to, the top 5 in the Forbes magazine, most of them were not from Cape Town. They chose Cape Town, and we city loves them for that. But there are obviously certain things people look at. So which cities people go to could change in the next couple of years, but I think it's going to continue very strongly, very, very strongly.
If you've got an introduction, if you can talk to the local authority in that area, I'll offer Gareth's services to come and talk to them and convince them to deregulate there also. Yeah. Anyway, Gareth, absolutely fascinating talk. Thanks very much. I mean, I'm reminded of so many things here. I've always had this big debate with town planners, current, excluding current people. When you think of Joburg, and I know a little bit about Joburg, all the moves to the north were not done by planning. As I understand it, it was done by the private sector. So you had the CBD, it jumped over the railway lines into Braamfontein, but that was the private sector. It then jumped into Rosebank, again the private sector. It then jumped into Sandton, again the private sector, and then north to Sunninghill and so on. And what the planners did is that they followed them and said, okay, now we're ahead of you and go, and now you follow us, so to speak. It's like that old story of the bird formation where the leader goes off in this direction and suddenly realizes he's not being followed, and then he jumps back in front and goes, leads the way. But it's very interesting how much of the development happens through private sector fighting the existing town planning scheme to get rezoning. And that is definitely what happened in Joburg. I also loved your example of I think you talked about giving the permanency of leasing or contracts with small informal traders. Well, I mean, I can remember going to Florence and been there a number of times because I've got family who live nearby. And I was fascinated. They're not exactly the same type of informal traders, but if you go into the streets of Florence, you'll see these very, very fancy carts. And by the way, when you're looking for a jacket or something, they haven't got one there. If you haven't been there, they take you to their shop, which is just around the corner. So this is just really a frontage. But I had a chat with one of the guys, and if you look on the street, they are marked out, number 33 and number 34 and number 35, and they are paying rental. So that is permanency. It's effectively like the city being the landlord. And the amount of rental they were paying was 20 years ago was millions of dollars a year. It was unbelievable how much they were paying. And the last one I want to mention is that it was talking about licensing here. The Free Market Foundation was quite heavily involved in deregulation. They went in the CISCA, and a lot of stuff was done, including Eustace and Leon, and reducing tax there and everything like that. And the one thing I remember is that they deregulated transport, and I'm sort of involved in transport and taxis and so on. And you know, generally you need a taxi license for a route or an area. And we were understood that it had been deregulated. But we went and spoke to the guy. He had a book over there, and this was the book that recorded who was there. So he said, we thought you deregulated licensing. He said, no, you just come here, put your name in here, and I'll give you a license. So he couldn't end up not doing it, you know. So I think there's that break with the history that they just found difficult doing. But effectively, it was a de facto deregulation. I think this is amazing what's happening. I mean, it's even more amazing when I heard it the first time. I mean, hopefully it'll be translated from what is somewhat a silent revolution into a very noisy revolution, and hopefully your touring around the country at various times will persuade people to do to follow suit, or to try out different types of examples, deregulations, and so on. And thanks again. I mean, I introduced you as having sort of now 3 or 4 careers. We've seen 3 of them. We've seen your academic side come out. We've seen your entrepreneurship come out, and the journalism side come out. We haven't seen the running and the hiking coming out. We'll see that at another time. Thank you very much. It was really fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.